Thank you. Super excited to be here with you. I want to commend you for something that I think is so awesome. You sing. Like, I've been to a few of these conferences for students, and a lot of times students sort of hang back and they watch, and there's cool sound and lights, but you guys are full on in, like, worshiping, and I can hear your voices even louder than the loudness of this, which is so awesome. So super well done. Give yourselves a round of applause for worshiping from your guts. So I arrived yesterday, and I got out of the car, and I ran into Kyla Martins. Where are you, Kyla? Right over there somewhere, maybe. Or are you over there? Anyway, Kyla's probably one of the only students that I could recognize out of this crowd. And I thought it was really interesting that I ran into the one kid that hey, I know you. I don't even really know her, just sorta. I know her family, and I've met her a few times. I know a little bit of her story because I know her bigger family. And I thought about that last night. Why did I run into Kyla? What's up with that? And I felt like the Lord said, you know her just a little bit. You know a little bit of her story. I know every single student in the room, and I know their whole story. That's you. And you, and you, and you, and you. God knows every intimate bit about each one of us. Anybody else born in the month of March? Shout out for all of us in March. So I'm born in March, really near a certain day that people like to celebrate in March. Anybody know what day I'm talking about? St. Patrick's Day, you got it. St. Patrick's Day. I'm not born on that day, I'm born on the 20th, but never mind. I got a few friends born on St. Patty's. Anybody else born on the 17th of March? Okay, oh yes, I got one guy right there. Awesome. Do you know, when we think about St. Patrick's Day, what do we think about? Green, Ireland, beer, leprechauns, limericks, pots of gold. Okay, but I wonder what you actually know about St. Patrick. So I want to tell you a little bit about him for a minute. Do you know that he wasn't Irish? He was actually English. And when he was 16 years old, how many in the room are 16 right now? Yeah. Yesterday, he turned 16 right here. Happy 16th. Listen, when Patrick was 16, his town got attacked by marauding warriors from, you guessed it, Ireland. And they captured Patrick, and they took him as a slave. 16 years old, taken into slavery to another nation called Ireland. And he was a slave for a lot of years. And at some point, before he escaped, he came to know Jesus. And he had God speak to him one night about how to escape. So he did. I think it was about 8 years in. He escaped, and he made his way to the coast, and he found a boat, and he got back to England. Now, if it was you or I that had escaped and got set free, I don't know, but I'd probably want to stay home. But Patrick was a young man who'd had Jesus get his attention as a teenager in the worst of worst situations, the most horrible of circumstances. And he learned to listen to Jesus. And so even though he was back in England and he'd been reunited with his family and his community of people there, he felt like God told him to go back to Ireland and to tell them the good news about Jesus so that they could be set free. How many of you would maybe not want to go? I wouldn't want to go. I'd be like, and you can send someone else. Right? Why would we want to go to the people that have been awful to us? Dan. Yeah. Bandana. Dan. Red bandana. That's your name, right? Do you remember last night? Of course you do. You're never going to forget that. When Eric talked right at you and he said you had to love your enemies. Well, actually, it's maybe particularly true for you. Maybe there's something God's going to show you about that word. But it's also true for the rest of us. That part of what it means to follow Jesus means we have to live differently. We have to practice love differently. And Patrick learned this at a young age, and he went back. He went back to Ireland and began to preach the gospel of Jesus. Now, I don't know, you're probably like super up on your church history from the 5th century, and you already know this, right? But what was amazing is Patrick began to plant churches, and he didn't do it by himself. He did it with other followers of Jesus. They went and they would establish what's called a monastic community. So, kind of where we get the current understanding about monks, and a lot of that history comes from times like Patrick and others that were part of his community of faith. They went and they practiced this radical love. You know this text in John 15 that says, they're going to know that you follow me. They're going to know you belong to me. How? By the way you love each other. Look around you at all the people sitting in your row, behind you and in front of you, and just think, these are the people Jesus calls me to love so that others know what we have is real, okay? Even Galatians 6 says, I think it's around verse 25, do good to all, but especially those who belong to the household of faith. That's the kids in your youth group. It's the senior citizens in your church. It's the little kids that are part of your church community. Do good to all, especially to those folk who belong to your household of faith. But Jesus also taught us that we had to go and embody this love in other directions, and Patrick knew that. So some people have identified his way as the Celtic way of mission. So what Patrick did is he went back, he took a bunch of friends, they embodied the love of Jesus, they lived in and among the people, and they started to do really good things to bring transformation to their culture. They started hospitals and schools and all systems of organizing for communities. That's where we get our model for towns, is from guys like this. They were the first community planners in many ways. They co-opted a bunch of holidays. Do you know about this? There's a lot of Druidism. And they were, in fact, his former slave master, his owner, was a Druid priest. He was a wicked, wicked man. In fact, I'll skip ahead. At one point, after some years of church planting all over Ireland, Patrick made his way back to his slave master to speak forgiveness to him and to pay his ransom. Because the guy lost a slave, he lost money. And so Patrick went back to pay that guy what he owed for his own price on his head. But the guy was so freaked out because Patrick was known by then to be such a man of God, and this Druid priest was so scared and just traumatized and tormented in himself that he took all his stuff into his house and he burned the house down, including himself. That was a weird story. I know, I'm freaking you out. All right. They decided to co-opt some holidays you and I know about. You ever wonder what Easter bunnies and chocolate eggs have to do with the death and resurrection of Jesus? Like, what's that all about, right? Well, it's this. The culture was having a celebration. It's a fertility cult celebration about new life. They set it at the springtime when rabbits procreate rather quickly. Right? You're awake? Yes. And chickens can have eggs every dang day, so that's another abundant life symbol. And guys like Patrick and his friends, they thought, yeah, we got a way better announcement of abundant life than fertility cult stuff, prostitution, and rabbits and eggs. We got something way better. We got the ultimate announcement of life. We got the resurrection of Jesus. He beat death. You can't get bigger than that. That's right. And so they put the celebration of abundant life and the good news of Jesus, they tied it to a cultural holiday, a cultural celebration, and it became the announcement. Now we think of Easter as being about the death and resurrection of Jesus predominantly, and we all enjoy chocolate. All right. So it's also why, I don't know, I'm probably going to burst a bubble here, okay? But do you know that Jesus probably was not born in December? Most scholars think he was born in the month of June. Any June babies out there? Yeah. You might share a birthday with Jesus. Who knows? Why do we celebrate his birthday, the Christ Mass, on the 25th of December? I'll tell you why. Because the 21st of December is the darkest day of the year. It's what's called the winter solstice. And there was all kinds of festivals and dark celebrations to celebrate literally the darkness. And so they thought, we better make an announcement of the light. This is actually why we decorate our houses with lights. Still, and our trees. It goes all the way back to these cultural holidays that these guys said, we got a better announcement of light in the darkness. It's when Christ was born. And so they located the biggest celebration of the year in a way that helped the people they were among, the community they'd been sent to. It made them able to understand the good news. I don't know if you know this, you probably don't, but I used to be one of you. I sat at History Maker a bunch of years ago. I won't tell you how many years ago because it's traumatizing. I'm old, okay? But the point is, I sat here when I was 13, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old student. I came year after year after year. And what I want to tell you is, it changed my life. It totally changed my life. That's why I said yes to this event, because it's like, well, it's kind of like coming home, but it's also something I really believe in, because I know what it was like to be a kid who was in a house filled with domestic violence and a ton of trauma, and I didn't know how to make sense of my life, let alone how Jesus could make sense of it. And could he actually change my circumstance? And could he use my life in some way? And I spent time worshiping just like you have been, and listening and leaning in. And God got a hold of my life at a History Maker event and set me on a trajectory to actually be someone who would impact the world around me. And he's doing the exact same thing in and through you. So I wonder if we were to look back in 1 year on this History Maker event, or 5 years, or 15 years, or 40 years, what would we have accomplished as a Christian community empowered by the Holy Spirit for the transformation of the world? What kinds of things? Maybe you won't be St. Patrick, but maybe you'll be somebody that was like the many nameless people that went with him to bring transformation into the world. And together we might affect all kinds of things in our culture for transformation in the way of Jesus. So let's think about this just for a minute. How did Jesus do it? He's the guy that built the first Christian community. He had the disciples and his followers. And we can learn what it looks like to be the people of God going forward in community by just looking at how Jesus taught those first ones in the Gospels. And then because you all love to read the Bible, right? Yes, you do. Even if you don't know it, you're going to get so wildly excited about the Word of God this weekend that you're going to start reading it every dang day and filling your heart and your mind up and getting all kinds of aha moments out of the Scriptures. So here's the thing. The book of Acts is the sequel to the Gospel of Luke. And if you read the book of Acts, you will understand how it was for the first followers, the first people who knew Jesus. How did they go and live out their way following Jesus in Christian community all over the world? And of course, they came under terrible persecution and had to run for their lives. And the gospel, the good news of Jesus, went absolutely everywhere. So read the book of Acts. But embodying the way of Jesus and the way Jesus taught people to follow his example actually is really rooted in the Old Testament. It's really important to read your Old Testament so that you know what it means to be God's people, because that's where it got forged. Anyways, there's this concept that Jesus and the early disciples would have been very familiar with, and it's this idea out of the Old Testament of justice, righteousness, that there's a way we can look like the heart of God in the world, embodying this justice, righteousness. And that was fully seen, fully realized in Jesus himself. There are lots and lots of biblical examples we could look at to see how that justice, righteousness got lived out in real time. But just think about Jesus for a minute. He was all the time demonstrating his love, not just to insiders, not to his best friends, not just to the disciples, but especially to the people who were most marginalized, most mistreated in the culture around him. He did really, really crazy, radical things like touching lepers. These were contaminated, diseased people. And every Jewish devout person knew that if you touched a leper, you would be made ceremonially unclean. You would have to go through 30 days of cleansing ritual. And Jesus didn't care at all about those rules, and he didn't care about the stigma, and he didn't care about what people would think of him if he had something to do with the leper. He would reach out his hand and touch them, and they were made well. He also ate with people that other people thought he should never share the table with. Remember that accusation? He eats with sinners and tax collectors, and you're like, ooh. Because we don't know what that means. But that's like so much stigma. The tax collectors were the guys that were in cahoots with the enemy army who was occupying the country. Some of you have studied a little bit of World War II. Try and put it in your frame of reference like this. The Nazis are in the Netherlands, and there's people that are informing on their neighbors. They're getting paid money by the Nazis to say who's hiding Jewish people. Those are the people that Jesus was willing to eat with. The people that were engaged with the enemy when they should have been protecting their own people. That's a way of understanding it. And then prostitutes, like people who were sex trade workers in his culture. There's always been stigma against street workers. You know this. It still exists in our culture. 2,000 years later, imagine the stigma against sex trade workers 2,000 years ago in the Middle East in Jesus' culture. And what did he do? He let them touch him. He wasn't afraid to be near them, to experience their presence, to be associated with them, and all the stigma that would come against him. He healed unclean people. He brought transformation that led actually to their inclusion in his community. So Jesus as king is probably the very best example we could ever have of what he's aiming for in terms of how the community of God's people live out his heart. So I want to talk about that for a minute, because Jesus changed the everyday reality for people by bringing his life to bear upon them. And that's exactly what he invites us into. Yes, should you love one another? You should love one another deeply. Is our culture completely self-absorbed and everything's about the individual? Totally. But we're not called to live that way. And not only are you supposed to look out for your brothers and sisters that are sitting all around you and demonstrate love toward them and live selflessly, he also calls you to give your life away in the way of Jesus. So Jesus showed us it's not just about the life to come, it's how we live right now that makes his kingdom known in the world. And he showed that when we live this out, it changes not just circumstances around us, but it changes us. Do you remember when he confronted the Pharisees in Luke 11? These guys were religious insiders. They were the uber church dudes. They were not bad people. We read it with a backward lens and we're like, oh, the Pharisees, they were so bad. But they were like actually doing a really diligent job trying to live perfectly so that revival would come. That was their great hope. And Jesus says this to them: you look great on the outside, but your hearts are full of greed and wickedness. And then he said to them what he thought the remedy was for them. Verse 40 and 41, but now as for what is inside you, that ugly stuff, he said, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God a tenth of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You guys are such diligent box tickers. You make sure that you put every little last bit of what you're supposed to give to God, even the herbs that are growing on your balcony. You make sure you give those to God. But you have forgotten to love the poor. You have forgotten what matters most to me. neglecting justice and the love of God. So where does this concept come from? Why would Jesus speak so directly to these uber church insiders, if you will, and try to show them how to live? Well, he's referencing a whole lot of things in the Old Testament, but I just want to highlight one really obscure passage, just to make you want to read the Old Testament, okay? This is from Deuteronomy 24, and it's verse 10 to 22, and I want you to really try to listen. I know you're excited about the food trucks, so am I, okay? You knew about the food trucks. You've all been looking at the app, and you know what's available. Okay, stop, hold on to your lunch ideas, put it in the back of your head for a second, and try and listen to this. This is not a nursery rhyme. This is not cheese ball stuff now. When we listen to the Word of God, we got to hear it, take it in. You ready? Very obscure, okay? Listen to this, and don't think it has nothing to do with you. We'll come to it in a minute. When you lend your brother anything, you shall not go into his house to get his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you lend shall bring his pledge out to you. And if the man is poor, you shall not keep his pledge overnight. You shall in any case return the pledge to him again when the sun goes down, that he may sleep in his own garment and bless you. And it shall be righteousness to you before the Lord your God. You shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether one of your brothers or one of the foreigners who is in the land within your gates. Each day you shall give him his wages, every dang day. Not on the 15th and 30th. Every day you shall give him his wages. And not let the sun go down on it, for he is poor and has set his heart on it, lest he cry out to the Lord and it be sin against you. You shall not pervert justice due to the stranger or the fatherless, or take a widow's garment as a pledge. But you shall remember you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this thing. And this is the really awesome part where we just tune right out, okay? When you reap your harvest in the field. Any farmers? There's a few of you. Great. How many of us are not farmers? Yeah. So when you get to a text like this, you don't just chuck it out and be like, I don't got no sheaves of wheat. Okay, listen. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord may bless you in all the work of your hands. And when you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. A lot of us got olive trees. Not a one of us, okay? Don't go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And when you gather the grapes of your vineyard, because we all are super fancy pants people who have wineries. Anyone? Okay, there's a couple. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this thing. Do you think this is the kind of text you could hear and think, well, this has nothing to do with me. I'm in grade 11, I'm in grade 9, I'm in grade 7. I got nothing. I don't have stuff like this. The point of this text, everybody ready? Your surplus belongs to the poor. Your surplus, your leftovers, your extras belong to the poor. And this is the orientation for God's people forever, thousands and thousands of years. And Jesus taught his followers the exact same thing. You remember the story of Ruth in the Old Testament? Honestly, I think still, if you go to UBC and you study in a LIP program, they make you study the book of Ruth. Do you know why? It's a perfect story. Did you know that? It's considered to be a perfect story arc. It's 4 chapters, folks. It'll take you 14 minutes to read the entire thing. So, just saying. Boaz is the guy that falls in love with her. It's a really cool love story, okay? But Boaz is the guy that falls in love with her. He practiced the very thing we talked about in Deuteronomy 24. He said to his staff, when they went out to glean and gather in the harvest, he said, don't just leave what remains on the ground. Pull out handfuls and drop it on purpose, for the poor that are going to come to gather. And of course, Ruth was one of those people. I don't know if you know this, but you do not need to save up all your income to buy more skins in your game. I'm just saying, you also don't need to just save up to buy more games. And you definitely don't need to save up all your amazing income as young people to buy more devices, newer devices. This is an actual fact. Look at our friend Eric. He got after this last night. I was hollering because he was trying to say to us, what do you invest in? What do you invest in that's for Jesus? Don't waste your life. And I want to say it's actually true of your time. It's also true of your resources, your money. Your surplus could actually change the world. Do you know that? How many of you, your mom and dad, want you to take out the recycling? Yeah? Lots of us. Do you know that that is a current day example of our leftovers? Do you know that those leftovers sometimes get a little bit worth money? Anybody? Yeah, and no judgment. Maybe you got a thing that you're working out with your folks where you get to go and do the recycling, you get to keep the money. Okay? But I would like you to know that in my house, my boys have learned since they were 2 and 3 that we don't keep the recycling money. They have to do all the work, and then we give it to the poor. This is an important principle from the scriptures that our leftovers can change the world. So some of what we've done with our money over the years is we've sponsored a compassion kid. Shout out to Alyssa and John. I don't know if they're in. That's the Rubik's Cube dude and his sister who was up here last night blowing our minds. Remember that? Okay, so you think, well, I can't sponsor a kid by myself because I'm a kid already and it's $40 a month or something. How would I ever do that? In community. We do it as the people of God. Did Patrick go back to Ireland and change Ireland all by himself? No, he did it in community. If we're going to embody the way of Jesus in the world, we got to do it together. So you could sponsor a kid. In fact, the last church I pastored at, the kids ministry, all the little kids, they banded together and put their money in. They bring money every week. They sponsored a kid in the Philippines all on their own. There are no adults involved. And then one day, my son, who was 4 at the time, was playing on the trampoline, and I saw him sitting out there for a while, and he looked like he was really thinking. And I said to him, what's going on out there on the trampoline? And he said, I think God gave me an idea. I said, did he? He said, yeah, we got to get Frederick a basketball. This is the boy in the Philippines. Long story short, those kids, they put their money together and they got a basketball because Finley had a word from the Lord. And that basketball became the basketball in the community in the Philippines. That's a big deal in the Filipino culture, basketball. Yeah, shout out about the Raptors. I don't know, people. I don't know. Maybe tonight. Wait, but here's the thing. Some little kids gave a basketball to a little boy on the other side of the world, and that little boy shared what he was given with all the people in his community. And do you think it felt like good news to that community? And do you think some of them might have come to know Jesus? I'm going to tell you, our kids in our church in September, we're not a big church. There's about 35 kids at their Sunday school that morning. We don't call it that. We call it Epic Kids. But they learned about people in slavery. Eric said it last night. Hi, bud. This is my son, Connor. Shout out. This is Connor. So they learned about what it means for people to be human trafficked. And one of the leaders said to our kids, hey, what do you think you could do about slavery in the world today? And I think she honestly expected that they could say we could pray. Do you remember what Annalise said we should do?
No.
Annalise said, she's 11 years old, she said we should have a bake sale next Sunday. I bet our whole Epic Kids could raise enough money to set one family free. So that came to staff meeting. We were like, well, we better do it. I mean, the kids thought it up. And so I sent an email out to the families. Hey, if your kids want to bake anything and bring it on Sunday, we'll let them sell it. Do you know how much money those kids raised the following Sunday? They didn't just set one family free, they set 5 families free. They raised $763. And the truth is, the parents didn't do it. It wasn't the adults that did it and then kind of made it look like it was the kids. The kids did it. And then in March, IJM, that's the International Justice Mission, came to visit our community to commend our children and to show them a photograph of a little baby that they set free. He was born in freedom because his family was rescued with the money our kids gave, and he was born in freedom 3 weeks after his family got rescued. You can change the world with your leftovers, with your excess, with your small bits in the practice of love. So at Christmas time, Connor has an older brother, Finley. They're 8 and 9. Connor's the 8-year-old. And at Christmas time, I asked you guys, what should we give to Jesus as a birthday present? What did Finley say?
I can't remember again.
Are you too nervous? You can remember. He said that we should set a family free. Yes, now it's all coming back. So he said we should set a family free. So what did you and Finn do to set a family free? Just 2 kids.
We made a granola factory.
They made a granola factory. They thought, what could we sell that everybody would want? We can make a bunch of money. And they knew everybody loves their mama's granola. So they had to work hard. They had to analyze how much it would cost. They had to go buy materials. Finley was really mad when he realized just buying the ingredients cost $172. He was already in the hole. He was just like, how are we going to make any money? And then after 1 weekend of selling these bags of granola, who had to bag it?
Me?
Yeah, Connor had a scale and he had to weigh everything out and they had to label it all. And then we sold the granola. And you made enough money to pay Mom back for the groceries. And did you reach your goal?
Yes.
What did you do?
We set a family free.
You set a family free. Now, Connor, was it easy to do that work?
No, I would rather play video games, but I was helping out.
Yeah, because we know that to love Jesus means we have to give up some of our life. So even though he would have rather play video games, he got his butt in there and ran that flippin' granola factory for 2 weekends, and then they set a family free. If some 7 and 8-year-old boys, because that's how old they were at Christmas, if they could do that, you just get your imagination engaged with the Holy Spirit, and with all the people sitting around you, you begin to ask Jesus, what could we do to bring your transformation into the world, to be history makers? That's good, bud. Thank you. Listen, shout out to Connor. There's one last thing I want to tell you. Do you know who the Apostle Paul was? Yeah, because he wrote like more than half of the New Testament. He's like the uber missionary guy. When Paul wanted to go on his very first missionary journey, he went up to Jerusalem. He'd been a Christian for 3 years. Remember, he was the guy that hunted Christians? You remember this? And he got knocked off his horse, blinded by the light. And then poor Ananias, I got to shake that guy's hand or high five him when we find him and the kingdom come. Because honest to God, the Lord told him, go and pray for Paul, so he can see. I'd be like, no thanks, I'd like to keep him blind. He hunts us, in case you didn't remember. Anyway, he goes and prays for him. Paul gets healed. And it takes him 3 years before he can convince the Jerusalem apostles, the disciples that walked around with Jesus, before he convinced them that he's a real Christian. Because they think he's like covert ops and he's going to like find out where they all are and then kill them all. This seems like a valid suspicion. Anyways, he comes to them, he says, look, I think the gospel's got to go to the whole world. Like the idea that Patrick had that the gospel could go back to Ireland, that actually started with a guy named Paul. And they said, oh, we bless you, go back to Antioch and preach, be kind to the people there, help form the Christian community there. But they didn't think the gospel was for the outsiders, the non-Jewish people. So how many more years went by? Because you're biblical scholars, 14 more years went by. 17 years after he had Jesus tell him the gospel was to go to the whole world, they finally agreed with him. The same as Mother Teresa, by the way. You know, she was teaching, you know who Mother Teresa is, right? Do you know that she was teaching private school at a high school in Switzerland? Desperate to go to the streets of Calcutta and care for the dying. And it took 17 years before the leaders in the church finally released her to go do the thing she was called to do. Same as Paul. Anyways, that's for free. Paul goes, and they say to him, there's only one thing we require of you. Only one thing. You're going on the greatest mission the world has ever seen. Okay? And it's actually, in my opinion, the same requirement for every one of us sitting in this room, thinking about how are we going to go and do the things Jesus has taught us. Only one thing we require of you. Galatians 2:10, one of my favorite verses in the New Testament. It says, remember the poor. And Paul says it's the very thing I was eager to do. So where are you going to start? You're going to ask the Holy Spirit to give you eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart to obey. It could happen to you in the cafeteria on Tuesday, that you happen to notice the one person nobody will talk to, nobody will sit with, the kid that everybody thinks smells, whatever, fill in the blank, and you're going to change the way you respond because Jesus has taught you to remember the ones on the outside. You're going to set aside some of your income because you're loaded. No, you're not loaded. You're going to set aside some portion of what you have. You're maybe even going to let it hurt a little bit because this is how Jesus taught us to live. You're going to risk, you're going to welcome, you're going to pray, and you're going to share. And you're going to practice on all the people sitting right around you. This is the way of Jesus. This is how we are the community of God going forward in the world. So wherever you live your life as followers of Jesus, I want to remind you and encourage you to announce his good news the way he did it. And in that, you'll always be remembering the poor. Yeah? The Lord bless you. Thanks for listening.